to welcome to LUMA writer Nalo Hopkinson. Nalo Hopkinson is a Jamaican-born... Nalo Hopkinson is a Jamaican-born Canadian speculative fiction writer and editor. Nalo, you teach creative writing at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. You have received the Damon Knight Memorial Grand Master Award, which is the lifetime honor from Science Fiction Writers for America. You've written 5 novels, including the award-winning Brown Girl in the Ring, and your writing often draws on Caribbean language and traditions. You've been a finalist for a Nebula Award, and you've won a World Fantasy Award. We're very happy to have you with us. We admire and recognize your immense contribution to composing sensible and groundbreaking imaginaries through your books, not only within the realms of speculative fiction, but more broadly in the fields of literature, art, and social and human sciences. And we're really excited to hear you. Thank you, Nalo, for being here.
Thank you, Selma. Yes, it is on. Good. Thank everyone for hanging in. It's been a dense day full of, what I love is the way that all our ideas start to echo each other. So my thank you to LUMA Arles for inviting me here. Thank you to Selma, Juliet, Luz, to everyone. I feel very welcomed and looked after. And I would like to thank LUMA for calling me an autrice in print. Many years ago, when I styled myself such during an interview in Nantes, Québécois author Elisabeth Vonabourg remarked on how unusual it was that I used the term. Unsure of my halting French, I asked her, but isn't that the feminine form of auteur? And she said yes, but that there was still a lot of sexism around the term, and that it was more usual at the time to say woman author. I gather that's changing, and I'm happy that institutions such as LUMA are contributing to making that change stick. So this is going to be a pretty roundabout, meandering talk. Hopefully it's an engaging journey. Hopefully the snippets of thoughts and ideas gel into your minds into some kind of coherent narrative. My brain is neurodiverse and works in associative ways which are only partially visible to me. I always struggle a little when people ask me to trace the various threads by giving nonfiction talks such as this one. I'm much more effective in fiction. But I've done what I can, and let's see where we get to. I have a handful of related issues to discuss, not much in the way of solutions. Often those come best out of the joint efforts of communities, so I'm raising the issues to you gathered here who are part of my community. I want to talk about translation, representation, definition by self and others, and hybridity. They're difficult to tease neatly apart, so I won't try to. I'll just ramble on for a bit. I was born in Jamaica, in the Caribbean. I have lived and have family in Jamaica, Trinidad, and Guyana, all in the Caribbean. Each Caribbean nation has its own characteristic languages, accents, and vernaculars. I sometimes write in Anglo-Caribbean vernacular speech. When I was first published, that was a rare thing in science fiction and fantasy. Someone once said to me that they liked it when I did so, but wouldn't want too many of me to become published because then people like me would become too common. That well-meaning person, not realizing they were doing so, had just hit the nail on the head. When you're seen as a novelty, a collectible item, your value relies on your scarcity. Uniqueness has a way of isolating you and limiting the access of others who have similar talents. It underscores the fact that the more enfranchised community feels it can only tolerate so many of you in existence, because otherwise you'd cease to be a spectacle and become, what? One of them? You'd belong, and that's what they erroneously don't want. I remember the very first public reading I ever gave of my fiction. Well, I remember the reading, but my memory of the venue is uncertain. It was in Canada. It may have been at the Ottawa Public Library. I remember sharing the train ride there and back from Toronto with 2 people. My friend Laurel, who is a children's librarian and, like me, a fan of science fiction and fantasy, and family friend Pamela Mordecai, a poet and scholar who's known me since I was born. Like me, Pam is Jamaican-Canadian. Laurel is Bermudian-Canadian. I think of Laurel as a fellow Caribbean person, even though Bermuda is in the Atlantic Ocean, 900 miles from the Caribbean Sea. It shares the Caribbean history of ravenous European colonization. It shares the result of said colonization, which happened complete with enslaved Africans and has brought about a smorgasbord of races, with a predominance of people with features like mine, and a creolization which remixes traditions from West Africa, England, the Isles of the colonial Caribbean, Portugal, and Old World Europe. The connections to Caribbeanness are in the Bermudian cuisine. It's even in the way Bermudians speak. When Laurel cuts loose in Bermudian vernacular, I can absolutely tell that her birthplace is a kissing cousin to mine. It's in the rhythms of her speech. So Bermuda is not technically in the Caribbean, but to me, that's a literal technicality. I keep coming back to this. The idea that clinging to notions of purity is often a thinly veiled attack on diversity. Anyway, there we were on the train, Pam, Laurel, and I, two Caribbean and one Caribbean-adjacent woman sitting across from each other. All three of us different shades of black, and all three of us involved in the literary world in some way. That conversation went deep, it went broad, we talked about everything. But right now, I'm leading up to that first reading I ever gave. I was one of a lineup of writers. When it was my turn, I went to the front and read the beginning part, all I had written at the time, of what would become my second science fiction novel, Midnight Robber. And here I offer my apologies in advance to the wonderful simultaneous translators who are here doing the very difficult and vital job of helping us share words across linguistic barriers, and doing so with extraordinary grace. They have my sympathies, and again my apologies, because the first paragraph of Midnight Robber goes a little bit like this. It had a woman, you see, a tall, hard-back woman with skin like cocoa tea. She 2 foot them tough from hiking through the Diable Bush, the devil bush on the prison planet of New Halfway Tree. She arms hard with muscle from hacking parts through the Diable Bush on New Halfway Tree. Even she hair herself rough and wiry, long black natty locks springing from she scalp and corkscrewing all the way down she back. She named Tan, and New Halfway Tree was she planet. All right, I'll switch back into more standard English now. So in what language is that paragraph from Midnight Robber written? It's clearly a variant of English, except those first 2 words, it had. Those are a direct translation from the French il y a. That's how people from Trinidad say there was. Trinidad is a nation once colonized by the French, and during that time, partly French-speaking. The way Trinidadians say sweetheart is doudou. Garbage dump is la basse. Their annual Can Boulé festival refers to Can Brûlé, which is the time of year the sugar fields were burnt down so that the ash would fertilize the next crop of cane. I wrote Midnight Robber in my own blend of Trinidadian, Jamaican, and Guyanese vernaculars. Those are the 3 Caribbean nations where I spent much of my girlhood. When I read from the novel, I do so in the Caribbean accent which comes most naturally, despite my being Jamaican, and that's a Trinidadian accent somewhat tempered by decades of living in Canada. When I published that novel in the year 2000, I'm pretty sure Anglophone science fiction had never seen anything like it. Not using Caribbean speech and certainly not centered in Caribbean culture. The novel is set in a distant future with wormholes acting as portals to other dimensions. But after that first reading I ever gave from it, an elderly black man came up to me and shook my hand. I'm from the Bahamas, he told me, Bahamas being another Caribbean nation. That man said the words were a bit different, but that the Bahamas had many of the same folk tales and traditions on which I was drawing to create my story. Then he said something I never want to forget. He said, "You give me hope that someday my grandchildren will be able to walk into bookstores and find stories about them." And that is beginning to happen, finally. The numbers of published Caribbean speculative fiction authors are still relatively low, but there are more of us every year. And I'm talking about the English-speaking Caribbean, except for Michael Roch, whom I met just yesterday. I don't know about the writers in the many other languages spoken in the region. Our books are usually published outside the Caribbean, and I know it's hard for Caribbean book distributors to get my work, so it's probably hard for the rest of us too. But the stories are there, and the number of authors is growing. That man at that event recognized our histories and cultures and struggles in my work, even though it's a novel of the far future. This kind of thing is why I named my talk Reclaiming the Past, Reimagining the Future. I wanted to steep us in the Akan notion of Sankofa, a symbol which means it is not wrong to go back for what you have forgotten. In other words, bring your past along with you. And hopefully what we should have here soon, yes, there we go, is the Adinkra symbol called Sankofa. It depicts a bird looking back over her shoulder. It's implied that she's just laid an egg because she's carrying that egg carefully in her beak. That egg would have come out behind her, her past, but she's picked it up and is carrying it forward with her into her future. I want us during the course of this talk to hold in our minds the idea that in order to create functional futures, we must all be involved, all our pasts, our histories, our cultures, our achievements, our pride, and our shame. That is the egg out of which the future will hatch. But currently, too many of us are left out of discourse about the future. Long before I aspired to be a writer, I was a reader, a voracious one since about the age of 3. My father, Nalo Hopkinson, was a poet, playwright, and actor who taught English and Latin in the final grade of high school. And my mother, who is currently listening, would go on to become a library technician, the person who decides how library material is classified. Whenever you see a collection of numbers and letters on the spine of a library book and a list of subject headings in the record of that book, a trained library technician is responsible. My parents were strict in many, many ways. Surprisingly, though, they almost never censored our reading. And it was a household full of books of all kinds. Books on art and folklore, literary classics, books written by my father's friends, a handful of outdated playboys left behind by a former boarder. Daddy did try to censor those by hiding them under the bed, but if you have or know children, you know that they have a whole secret life which is conducted by tunneling under things, tables, beds. By the time Daddy discovered me reading the old playboys and took them away from me, I had been reading and rereading them for years. In fact, I read science fiction for the first time in one of those magazines. It was an excerpt from Kurt Vonnegut's Welcome to the Monkey House. As a child, I read for pleasure much, much more than I do now. I read things I couldn't understand, which I have a difficult time doing now. I recently tried, unsuccessfully, to reread Homer's Iliad, a book which I originally found on my dad's shelves as a child and read frequently for certain values of read. In other words, when I was young, I skimmed anything I didn't understand and instead lingered over scenes of monsters and magic. Young reader me continued to gravitate towards stories of the unreal, folklore, and fantasy. When I was a preteen, my mother gave me her adult library card, and that's how I discovered science fiction, searching the adult library shelves for the types of stories that I liked. Science fiction and fantasy were the continuation of the literary discourse I had entered through folklore and the classics. Science fiction and fantasy entirely absorbed me. To this day, the far greater part of the fiction I read is the literature of the fantastic. Fast forward a little over a decade to when I discovered that one of my favorite authors, Samuel R. Delany, from whom we heard last night, is a Black man. Nowadays, it's not especially earth-shattering to discover a Black author in science fiction. Still novel, but not unheard of. But back then, Delany was one of the first 4 that I was able to find. The others were Charles Saunders from Canada, Stephen Barnes from the US, and Haitian-Canadian Claude Michel Prévost. I began to wonder where there were other Black authors in the genre. I was by that time a clerk working in public libraries. Near as I could discover through library searches, there were 3 more, all American, Tananarive Due, Octavia Butler, at the time very much alive, and Nisi Shawl, who had just had their first short story published in Asimov's magazine. I tore through the books and stories of all 7. And at the same time, I was realizing that science fiction and fantasy are underpinned by folklore, folkways, and the cultural specificity of folk tales. That in fact, science fiction and fantasy are about culture, about the cultural upheavals that occur when cultures meet and one has greater firepower. And it frequently uses folklore as metaphorical imagery and backdrop. When I cast my mind over the large amount of science fiction and fantasy I was absorbing annually, I perceived how much folklore was embedded in it, specifically British and European folklore, with a smattering of Japanese lore, usually written by non-Japanese authors. Bear in mind that this is changing quickly. I'm talking about then, not now. I couldn't find much of any other folklore, and I sure as hell didn't find anything Caribbean. I couldn't find the Caribbean represented at all. Not in lore, not in settings, not amongst the authors. I did find one short story written by an American writer in which a character stranded on a desert island survives by drinking the juice of breadfruit. But one can no more juice a breadfruit than one can juice a loaf of bread. It's called breadfruit for a reason. It was clear to me that the author had never been within spitting distance of a breadfruit. It began to occur to me that, one, I was nowhere in the literature I loved so much, and two, the 7 Black speculative fiction authors I had found showed that there might be a way I could belong. I'd never really had the urge to become a writer. I was a reader. My father was the writer. But this is how I began to develop that desire and work towards it. I knew a lot of Anglo-Caribbean folklore. I knew a lot of the speculative fiction canon. Maybe I could find a way to combine the two and tell my own stories. Long story short, I've been managing to do exactly that, among other things my work does and other cultures into which it ventures. Representation, even the tiny smidgen of it that existed at that time, was the engine that ignited a new writer into being. Here's how important representation is. For the past 13 years or so, I've been a university professor of creative writing. While writing fiction is my creative practice, teaching it pays the bills. And I also really enjoy interacting with students. I once had a young Black undergrad come into my office. He'd been about to drop out of school. He was having a hard time with the systemic racism he encountered while trying to navigate the university. He'd developed idiopathic stomach pain. Doctors couldn't figure out what was causing it. All around, he'd been miserable, psychologically and physically. Then he took a course in which the professor discussed Afrofuturism. It was the student's first time being introduced to the concept. He sucked up all he could and started developing ideas that would be written in that vein. His bellyache disappeared. It went clean the fuck away. And someone told him about me, so he came to my office to ask me whether I would mentor him through an Afrofuturism fiction thesis for his final undergraduate year. I was the only prof on campus with expertise and a solid track record in writing in that mode, and I fortuitously had a connection to Afrofuturism. He told me his ideas, we discussed the Black speculative imagination, and he began working on his piece. He was researching as quickly as he could, incorporating African diasporic folklore, West Indian food, Black American speech patterns. It was strong work. He graduated with an A. That was a few years ago. A few weeks ago, he contacted me to ask whether I'd write reference letters for him. He's applying to grad school. He found a sliver of space in which he could exist, and he took from it what he needed in order to keep moving forward. It's popular out in the world, the North American world in which I currently live, to view science fiction and fantasy as lightweight, silly, inconsequential, escapist. But it was Black author Walter Mosley who said something to the effect of, certain of us desperately need to escape the world we're in or to remake it. It's not escapism, it's planning. In order to remake the world, we need to be able to imagine the world we want. Also, let's not forget that it's also enjoyable. I'm often asked to explain my love of science fiction and fantasy, and I can absolutely respond in some noble vein of wanting to imagine that the world can be a better place, and that is indeed part of the truth. But that truth showed up quite a bit after simply enjoying the genre. Samuel R. Delany is one of my touchstones, and he has said, "We need visions of the future, and our people need them more than most." In 1998, the same year I published my first novel, Brown Girl in the Ring, I heard about something called the Afrofuturism listserv. I'd never heard the term Afrofuturism before. It intrigued me, so I investigated. I liked what I discovered because it solidified in my mind what I was trying to do with my fiction. I wanted to know more, so I ended up joining the listserv, which was the brainchild of American scholar Alondra Nelson, who's also been mentioned earlier today. The listserv brought together artists, musicians, and scholars interested in researching and producing Afrofuturistic texts. And that all sounds very calm and measured, and sometimes it was, but we also did a lot of passionate arguing. It was through the Afrofuturism listserv that I met Ron Eglash. His book, African Fractals, investigated fractals in African art and culture. It was through that lens that I, who failed math once we got past algebra, finally began to understand fractals. I met DJ Spooky, aka That Subliminal Kid, and would go on to do a joint performance with him in which I read from Midnight Robber to his backing DJ mix, which included old Maroon songs. I met author Aize Jama Everett and queer hip-hop artist Juba Kalamka, who have both become dear friends. And I met Alondra, who would go on to become Deputy Assistant to US President Joe Biden and Acting Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. The experience gave me peers, and it began to clarify my own creative project to me. It was and is invaluable. In a very few years, people began talking about Afrofuturism as a movement. At first, I resisted the thought, but I've given in. However, here's the thing about movements: they can never be comprehensive. The minute it coalesces into a movement and is taken up as such by lots of people, it becomes codified. There will be those who will try to fit into it rather than aiming to become one of the change makers working within those ideas to do their own thing. And it will, with the best will in the world, invariably become a homogenizing Procrustean bed. Or it will omit aspects which on the face of it are too nuanced to be included. For example, I encounter many people who think Afrofuturism is a genre. They think it's what you call science fiction when it's written by Black people. But as you've heard, it is a lens, not a container. And, as you've also heard, not all science fiction stories by Black people are Afrofuturist. I was delighted when people began to identify my work with Afrofuturism, and I still am. That hasn't changed. But I bring the same sensibilities to my fiction, which is fantastical, not futuristic. And that is most of my fiction. Is that still Afrofuturism? Because it's not futuristic, the term doesn't quite fit. I first heard the term the Black speculative imagination from scholar, professor, and comics artist John Jennings. I like it a lot. It encompasses the fact that Black speculative fiction writing doesn't always separate itself neatly into the futuristic and the fantastical, thus putting science and spirituality into different camps. Black speculative imagination as a term of analysis lets us contemplate work which clearly shares sensibilities that viewed from mainstream perspectives would be classified as different genres or as ignorant of genre conventions. The work of Caribbean spec-fic writers often gets called Afrofuturistic and is analyzed in those terms. However, our work rarely gets associated with the Caribbean issues and histories it explores. And that's putting aside the fact that Caribbean histories, cultures, and racial identities are hybridized and creolized, not solely African in origin. The region is also home to Chinese, South Asian, European, Taino, and Latinx peoples. Many of us spec-fic authors from the area yearn for more critical analysis of our work from a place of understanding and knowledge of the complex realities of the Caribbean region, as well as a deep knowledge of the spec-fic canon and the current discourse around it. There are only one or two scholars I've encountered who have the training. The center of North American science fiction fantasy publishing is in the US, as I dare say is the bulk of North American science fiction and fantasy scholarship. Yet the impression I get is that the country as a whole is barely aware that the Caribbean exists, despite the numbers of Caribbean people who call America their home. I mean, to be honest, mainstream American ignorance of anything originating outside its own borders is legendary, so it's not just a problem for Caribbean writers and artists, but that's my background, so that's what I'm discussing. I've seen Caribbean spec-fic dismissed by reviewers as light summertime beach reading, because the reviewers didn't have the knowledge and training to recognize the pressing themes the fiction explores. Caribbean writing and scholarship has begun to float the terms Caribbean futurism and the Caribbean fantastic. So I look forward to seeing what sensibilities that will bring to the genre. And let me reiterate, I'm not interested in abandoning Afrofuturism, not at this juncture. I love the discourse. I'm disinterested in the tokenizing notion that there can be only one umbrella term. I would love us to get better at talking about and grappling with the fact that our genre definitions are permeable fuzzy sets, not strict borders, and that some works are capable of existing in many places at once. One of the hybridities I try to accomplish is in my approach to neologisms. That is, coining new words. That is something that science fiction revels in, and one of the ways it can expand a reader's thinking. Another of my former mentors, author Jeff Ryman, once said that all science fiction and fantasy are written in translation. The stories create non-existent alien worlds and try to make them comprehensible to us, try to engage our empathy. A former student of mine, Canadian, now teaches English in Korea. He has at times given students my novel Midnight Robber to read, and of course they struggle with a hybrid, unfamiliar vocabulary and with cultural references most of them don't recognize. I once asked him how his students responded to the novel. He told me that many of them are puzzled by my choice to use common speech at all. I asked why. Apparently they don't understand why I wouldn't want to demonstrate my linguistic competence and garner respect by using the standard form of English. Well, for one thing, while I would like to be respected, I have little interest in being respectable. It's not limited to Korean readers. Every so often, someone turns up their nose at a story of mine in which characters speak in vernacular. They ask why I would mock the characters by having them sound, quote unquote, uneducated. There are Caribbean literary trailblazers who preceded me. I mean, well, there are many, but now I'm specifically speaking about the ones who insisted on writing the way we speak, especially our baselectal registers. Baselectal is the closest to common colloquial speech. Mesolectal is what you might hear in a white-collar workplace. Acrolectal is more like what we call BBC English. Writers like the Trinidadian author Samuel Selvon, like Merle Hodge, Derek Walcott, Aintu Springer, Kamau Brathwaite, Lillian Allen. Those people have fought to have everyday speech recognized as valid language with its own rules and sensibilities which have nothing to do with the level of education. They fought to defend their right to write in the vernacular when they wished. I mean, if your English is up to it, listen to this stanza in Baselectal Jamaican from Uncle Time, a poem by Dennis Scott. You cannot convince me that Dennis's linguistic choices here demonstrate that he has no grasp of his craft or that he's mocking his protagonist's speech and level of insight. Uncle Time is a Spider-Man, cunning and cool. Him tell you, watch the hell and you see me. If you ain't quick enough to see how I move like mongoose, man, you think him fool? Yet here's the rub. How do you translate something like this into another language? The phrase Spider-Man is a folklore reference that almost anyone from the West African diaspora will recognize, but will anyone else? Does it matter if they don't? How about the deep baselectal phrasing of, "Fi ain't quick enough to see I move like mongoose"? And what about that word mongoose? That single word has many connotations that might not be understood by a reader who didn't grow up with marauding wild mongooses. Going deeper yet, how do you convey the socioeconomic and racial realities of the protagonist implied by the use of common class speech of someone who does manual labor? Perhaps even more vexing, how do you do this when your country has a national institution which exists to control written speech and to limit it to only the standardized form of the language? French translations of my work which erase the vernacular, in doing so also erase the characters' experiences of systemic injustice. My characters end up coming across as privileged white people acting petulant. Anyhow, thank God humans are naturally contrary and defiant and prone to ignoring stuffy institutions, because no matter how ignorant I may be of French literature, I know people. So I have been confident that French writing happens, which explores linguistic and regional registers, and this weekend has proved me right. And yes, I just uttered a dig against the French Academy, but don't worry, I also have great things to say about French literary traditions, which have advantages I envy as a writer who gets published in North America. For instance, here, bande dessinée are respected as literature. Genre fiction is respected as literature. That's not so where I'm located. I'm so envious. And those of us who write comics and genre fiction are always battling to have our work viewed as legitimate. I'm going to wrap up now. Back to translation. How do you translate spec-fic neologisms so that the translation has the same or similar mind-expanding effect as the original? Yesterday, I overheard one of the translators at this conference discussing with Isaiah Lavender how he might most effectively translate Isaiah's word background. Have I mentioned how much respect I have for translators? It's an art form in itself. Science fiction speculates on the future, but even though this is changing, it's still very popular to romantically imagine that humanity's best future will be a homogenized one. That what we want is one big world culture so that no one has to feel guilty about cultural appropriation. That the pesky concept of race will disappear because human beings have interbred to the point where we're all just human and no one has to think about racism. A good future, apparently, is one in which we've all been assimilated, in which we are all indistinguishable from one another, in which we've all become the Borg. What gets swept under the rug in this deracinated concept of the future are the lovely cultural specificities which humans create. And I've rambled to the end of my thoughts here. As I said, no solutions, just provocations. I'm looking forward to the discussion to follow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nalo. I don't know if anyone has any question. It can be in French. We can translate. Thanks to our amazing translators. Thank you. Ah.
Thank you so much. It was just, I wanted to hear more about that bird because it was very beautiful what you said, but a little too quick. I wanted to hear more about it.
There's a system of pictograms in the Akan culture, which is West African from the region of Ghana. There are hundreds of them, and they each represent a complex concept. And it used to be that only royalty could use them, but now you can find them on handbags. You can find them, there's one on my shoulder. And the concepts are often just gorgeous. So this one is about not losing track of your past in your drive to move forward. The other way it gets translated is go back and get it. So it's a concept that we talk about a lot, that you can find all through the world, that we should not forget our past, that that's not the way to move forward in a holistic way. Does that help?
Any other questions? Maybe to wrap up, since we're a bit late, just one more question, because at some point you said that you talk a lot about translation because your use of language is very specific. And at some point you also said that science fiction or fantasy or speculative fiction in general is a way of translating the present into the future. Is that something you can maybe expand on, how there's this relationship to both the past and how there's something maybe which also circles back to what Isaiah was saying about how the genre is needed to write people into that future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I said was that it translates the future for the present.
True.
And fantasy, I think, translates our stories about ourselves across cultures, stories about who we are. And I struggle every few years to come up with an explanation of what I see science fiction and fantasy doing, because I always get challenged about why would I write it. And it was when Jeff Ryman said to my class at Clarion that all science fiction is written in translation that I realized we're doing something very, very complex when we create new coinages, when we create new cultures in science fiction and fantasy, that we are engaging the mirror neurons, neuron miroir, that allow human beings to engage their empathy, which is one of the things that fiction does. But mimetic fiction, fiction which mimes reality, does so by helping us engage that empathy into existing worlds. Science fiction and fantasy go outside the existing, which I think is one of the ways we get to imagine ourselves into something that hasn't happened yet or that never happened. We get to recast the past, we get to re-envision the future, literally at a somatic level, at a body-based level.
Thank you so much, Nalo.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please stay with us for a quick drink, and we'll also have some books. You can get them signed by Nalo, by all the authors, and thank you all for staying with us this afternoon. We see you tomorrow.